too, to a certain extent, are an attempt to concretize the spiritual, that it's an attempt to take moral values and then, if Burke said that you can't teach morals and ethics, you can only teach manners, then it's an attempt to create a system of manners that are iteratable across this entire group of people and create skin-in-the-game buy-in. And that allows you an enormous amount of freedom of thought, because if you all agree that you're going to, say, keep Sabbath together and keep kosher together, or if you're in the United States and you're Christian, you're all going to go to church together on Sundays, and that you're not going to go out to party.
You've established a minimum, an acceptable minimum of shared practice.
Right, and when you do that allows for the possibility of freedom, because I trust you enough to know that you're not trying to destroy my in-group. You're part of my in-group by putting this sort of skin in the game, and so much of religion is about that. It's about, those shared rituals that allow you to be part of the in-group. And then the question becomes whether that in-group is so exclusive as to bar outsiders. But ideally, your in-group should bind everybody together without being so exclusive that it creates, an othering effect where everybody else becomes the enemy.
Yeah, well, we tend not to think of belief as that which underlies practice. Because we're so Athenian now, I would say, in some sense, in our worldview, that we tend to think of belief as only descriptive practice, right? The description, per se. Like, here's the set of facts about the world that I believe are true. That's truth, and that's... But there's predicates of belief that are what objects of faith, I suppose, but also they're part of what you presume to be true, almost by definition, because you wouldn't act them out. And so one of the things that those who criticize the religious enterprise don't understand is that there are immense elements of it, perhaps the most important elements, that aren't the least bit propositional. So some of it is practice. What do you do? So how do you ritualize your activity along with other people?
Right.
And then there's a whole emotional dimension of it. Well, the call to prayer is part of that.
For sure.
Right? There's a musical element to that, and there's the attempt to instill awe that's certainly characteristic of, let's say, great church architecture. That's particularly true of what the Europeans managed with their church architecture. And to reduce it to a propositional description, you make religion, you can argue it out of existence as soon as you do that.
Exactly, and I think that once you do that, people, again, the word embeddedness comes to mind, but religion is an embedded way of living, and I think it's why the West has failed to come to grips with the strength of religion and the continuing strength of religion. So in the West, religion's been largely undermined in favor of a sort of secular materialism, and then everybody wonders, why are all these weird ancient people clinging to their faiths? And it's like, well, you've created a set of new faiths that seem not particularly wonderful. And maybe it is just the fact that man is a faith creature who's always going to seek this sort of embedding. And the question is whether you accept methods of the past for embedding and then gradually change them to adapt to current circumstances, or whether you're creating out of your own head systems of embedding to combine people in these forces. And the systems you're creating out of your head, like most systems created from pure human thought, are really bad. That's not the way that most thought happens.
We also think that in the West, the way we act is a consequence of the way we describe the world. But the way we act is actually a consequence of
how you're brought up and your culture.
It's also 400 years of Enlightenment manifestation since the dawn of the scientific revolution, modifying the ways we act. We think that we act because of a set of propositions. We think if we just tell other people those propositions, then they'll act that way because we think that's how we act.
Right.
But that isn't how we act.
Exactly. I mean, and this is why, when George W. Bush was saying there's a desire for freedom in every human heart, it's like, well, maybe yes, but not freedom as you define it, meaning that George W. Bush's definition of freedom wasn't necessarily the definition of freedom of people living in Iraq or people living in Israel or people living in China. Like, not everybody has the same definition of these words. They have ways of life that they wish to preserve, some better, some worse. I'm not a moral relativist on this sort of stuff, but this sort of idea that there's a universal language of freedom that every human heart speaks runs in direct opposition to the fact that there are a bunch of conflicting values in the human heart, and they are organized in particular hierarchies, and those hierarchies are not always the same. It was pretty cool to walk up the pilgrimage road with you. So this is something that they've discovered over at the city of David. Their sewage pipe burst down in the middle of Silwan, which is an Arab area, and they didn't tear down any of the Arab housing. They instead decided to dig, and they've uncovered this entire pilgrimage road that runs about half a mile from the bottom of the hill all the way up to the Temple Mount. actually walking through history is kind of an amazing thing, and it does lead you to the literalism and spirituality of the Bible, the idea that you're on a physical ascent to the axis mundi, and that's a spiritual ascent as well, that the physical is supposed to mirror the spiritual is perfectly evident in that road.
And that you're going up, and up, of course, metaphorically is towards the good. And so that's laid out on the geography. Then you have that metaphoric idea made manifest in the road, and then people can walk that, and they're walking a spiritual path and a physical path at the same time. And that is, in some sense, the union of Jerusalem and Athens, right? The physical. We talked about that today, too, with the discovery of the archaeological artifacts. And so the archaeologists who are digging here are using scientific archaeological principles, but they dig up artifacts that are objects that are reflective of the biblical narrative, because they've demonstrated that many of the people named in the biblical narrative actually existed. And so now they're nailing the narrative, which was starting to float off in space, back down to the object, and revitalizing the narrative as a consequence.
I thought you made a beautiful point about this. We were talking about one of those seals, and one of those seals had an ancient name on it that's described in the book of Kings. And you were pointing out that, you know, even the smallest things that we kind of discard in our daily life may have ripple effects and resonances 2,000 years into the future or 3,000 years into the future in this particular case. And I thought it was a really kind of great lesson for a lot of people.
Yeah, well, that's another example of that sort of infinite iteration. You don't know how each of your actions or even your utterances echo. You don't know what you're doing when you launch them forward into the world, because there's a spirit embodied in them in some real sense. That's certainly true of every sentence that you utter. And God only knows how that shifts and changes the structure of reality. So it's a daunting idea.
I did get a kick out of you on the speakers platform over there. They've uncovered the speakers platform, which was essentially, I guess, the free speech zone of ancient Jerusalem. Yeah, I mean, the idea that people were constantly bickering and fighting and trying to remind each other of the biblical values, even at that time, it gives, number one, the lie to the idea that there was sort of this golden past where everybody acted well, because obviously that wasn't true. People were being chided throughout the Bible. But it also reminds you that dissent within the biblical context, dissent to the good, was a vital component of biblical thought. So everybody thinks that the Bible is particularly doctrinaire. There's the Old Testament, and then there's a bunch of prophets, and the prophets come along, and all they're doing for hundreds of pages is just chiding people to act better and reminding them of their obligations. And that's a pretty strong form of dissent to a sort of doctrinaire ideal, supposedly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it was very interesting to see the archaeological dig of the road, and to imagine that now being laid back out so that entire pathway up to the Temple Mount can be, well, it'll be underground, but people will be able to walk on it again. That's really something. And to think that was discovered because of a leak in the sewer pipe, and that was all buried underneath there and ready to be re-excavated and restored, that was really something to see. That's
Jerusalem. Your toilet breaks and you find a piece of 3,000-year-old archaeology that bespeaks the book of Kings or something. So that's amazing. And then we were able to go to the culmination of that, and that, of course, is when we went up onto the Temple Mount. The hottest piece of property on planet Earth, definitely the flashpoint for an enormous amount of conflict, but also spirituality.
Yeah, well, that was the tensest part of the day.
Very tense.
Right? Do you want to explain why that is a bit?
Yeah, I mean, so just geopolitically speaking, Israel in 1967 conquers the rest of the old city of Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount compound. The Muslims call it the Al-Aqsa compound. You can hear the muezzin call going out right now from the Al-Aqsa compound. And Israel immediately hands the keys to the Temple Mount compound to the Islamic Waqf, which is handled by Jordan. So Jordan is in control of many of these sort of laws and regulations on the Temple Mount site, while the Jewish state is in control of the territory, but that actual part is controlled by Islamic authorities. Islamic authorities dictate the Jews and Christians are not allowed to pray openly on the Temple Mount. You're not allowed to carry any open symbols of Christianity or Judaism up onto the Temple Mount. Your wife had to put her cross away while we were walking up there. If I wanted to walk in certain areas, I had to put on a baseball cap. You took a photo next to your wife, and they were telling you that you had to separate from your wife, presumably because, as with the old Protestant dancing jokes, dancing may lead to, So you standing next to your wife was a threat. So, it's very heavily regulated. There are people who are essentially following you around, watching you to watch for violations. If you violate those rules, you could theoretically be arrested. And so it's very tense. I mean,
you could see up there the battle between maps being played out on a territory itself. So the Dome of the Rock had been built over the
foundation stone, the Holy of Holies.
Right. And so it's the replacement of one center of the world by another center of the world. And that center point in this city is the Temple Mount. And so a huge part of the dispute that still exists here is what map is going to predominate on that territory, or what assemblage of maps. And even though that's a psychological battle, the battle is actually fought over actual territory by actual people. And so in that sense, I suppose it's actual as well as psychological. It's very interesting to be in a place where the map meets, multiple maps are juxtaposed with the territory in such a self-evident way, in such a troublesome way.
Yeah, it is an amazing thing, and especially when you're in Jerusalem and you can just look around the city and you see the proximity. I think for people on just a political level to understand the Middle East conflict, it's almost impossible to do without actually being in an area where you see just how close things are to one another. I mean, we walked out the Cotton Gate, which is in the Arab quarter, and you walk from there into the Jewish quarter back toward the Western Wall, and these things are cheek by jowl with one another. I mean, there is no separation. You're talking about areas. I mean, literally right behind us is Silwan on this area, and this is a largely Arab area, a largely Muslim area. And back here, up there, is a largely Jewish area, and they are right next to each other. I mean, they're in the same camera shot, and that has significant ramifications when people say, well, why don't they just figure out a way to live together in peace, or why don't they just find a way to separate from one another? Why don't you split Jerusalem?
People always say that. Why don't they just find a way to live together in peace? And the whole problem with that sentence is the just part. It's like, well, that's the simplest thing in the world, to live in peace. It's like, is there peace in your family? You think that's so simple? Is there peace in your heart? And then you're trying to get all, you can make a statement like that, and well, if people just, grew up, or if they just got their act together, they'd live in peace. It's like, I don't think there's anything more difficult to attain than peace.
For sure.
I mean, I don't even know if you can attain peace in your own heart in some sense, unless peace also reigns all around you. And so that might mean the peace that you have in your own heart can't even come about until peace is established everywhere.
Well, in Hebrew, the word for shalom, or for peace, is shalom, which also is the word for complete, right? Shalem means to be full or complete. And so the idea of peace requiring fullness, that it can't be divided, is, we tend to think of peace as it's the thing you make between opposites. It's the thing you make between warring factions. But you can't really
and then you think about it as a compromise, and that's also not true.
Peace can't be made as a compromise. There has to at least be a fundamental agreement on the principle underlying it, or peace is just not going to last.
There has to be a unity and a higher principle. If you're trying to make peace with your wife, she wants something and you want something. The best way to make peace is for both of you to put your heads together and think about how you can both have more than you could have separately, together. And then you have peace, because people think, oh, that's a good deal. I have more than I needed and wanted as a consequence of that arrangement. And that's a peaceful negotiation. And that's a very difficult thing to do. So,
especially in this region of the world, it's definitely a very rough thing to do. I mean, I think that the Abraham Accords are a great way of coming to some of those agreements. It's people recognizing that they have priorities other than sort of the religious conflict. We'll put that aside and we'll agree to the things that we can agree to and work on those things together.
Well, on the Temple Mount, you can see, in some sense, people of the three Abrahamic faiths are trying to fight out, and somewhat peacefully, thank God, somewhat peacefully, how that site can be holy across three different traditions.
It is important to recognize here that only happens under Israeli auspices. From 48 to 67, when Jordan ruled this area, is completely banned to Jews. They wrecked synagogues and churches. It's an unfortunate reality that it's going to take reformers in,
Well, it seems like they're making progress on that front in the United Arab Emirates, right? They're building that tri-faith facility there, and there is some real attempt there, as far as I can tell, and this is part of the spirit of the Abraham Accords, to think that maybe there's enough commonality between the Abrahamic people to unite them, especially maybe in the face of all the threats to that entire Abrahamic tradition that are making themselves manifest in the world.
Well, that's the thing that I've been discussing with Muslim friends of mine, people who wildly disagree with me about things like Israel or Middle East peace. We've been talking about the fact that maybe the true threat to religious practice is not the people who practice the other Abrahamic faiths. Maybe the true threat is an ideology that seeks to
just dissolve the religious enterprise entirely.
Right, exactly.
And it doesn't even, because what it does is, the thing is that what happens when you dissolve a functional religious tradition, which would be one that was at least capable of uniting people over some span of time, just speaking in the least religious sense possible, you tear that apart. You replace it with some idiot ideology that can't propagate itself across time for even a couple of generations. You think, well, that's not true. It's like, yeah, this is one of the things that always bothered me about the new atheists. It's like, well, what about the fascists? What about the communists? I mean, those ideas sprang out of, I would say, something approximating a secular humanism. It's like, oh no, that had nothing to do with secular humanism.
French Revolution.
Like,
this has been
okay, fair enough, guys, but you had. What you had was the demise of one religious system and the instant emergence of a religious system that was so unbelievably pathological that it made the previous pathological religion look like a complete paradise. You want to have, what do you want? You want the czars or you want Stalin? It's like, read your history and you'll figure out that real fast.
Exactly. And again, I think that goes back to the idea that if there is a higher ethic to be discovered, and if it is out there, if it's objective, and if that ethic has been revealed, and if it was revealed in Jerusalem, let's say, and that's what Jerusalem represents, then that higher ethic can't come out of us. I think that the lie of Marxism is that it was a discovery about the universe that was objectively true and therefore would instantiate itself over time naturally. And that, of course, was false. The predictions that Marx makes about economics and about what was going to happen in history were completely not true.
Well, and even when they were true, they weren't true for the reasons he thought they were true. Like the idea that capital accrues in the hands of a smaller and smaller number of people is sort of true in that a minority of people always tend to have the majority of the control over any given creative product. That seems like a natural law in some sense. You see that manifested itself in all sorts of domains that aren't merely economic. But he was wrong in that was the consequence of capitalism per se. He was wrong that other economic systems wouldn't produce the same end. He was wrong also in that there is a 1% that controls 90%, but the people who occupy that 1% churn a lot.
Right.
A lot.
And most clearly he was wrong about the immiseration of the workers. The idea that the workers would be immiserated and so there would be a worldwide revolution was clearly false. So the faith was falsified. So the answer was to change the nature of the claim of the faith, which was sort of Lenin's great discovery. Is if I just sort of pretend that the historical projections never happened, or here's the reason why they didn't happen, and so they still might be fulfilled by a peasantry in Russia, which was precisely the opposite of what Marx claimed. He thought it was going to be a middle class or a lower class in Britain, an industrialized nation who had been immiserated by working the factories, and instead it turns out to be a bunch of serfs in Russia who are rebelling against the landlords.
Yeah, it also turned out that people weren't comparatively immiserated by the factories. In fact, they were comparatively elevated by the factories.
Right, exactly.
And so even though those factories, well, you can see what happened when the factories got established in China, is the Chinese decided pretty damn quickly that working on a farm or on a factory was a hell of a lot better than perishing while starving under Mao.
So the utopian creations of our own brains are significantly more dangerous, historically speaking, than a gradual evolution of a well-accepted system of ethics that result particularly in a series of commandments that can be enacted in daily life, and significantly less fulfilling also, because again, all of the modern theory that's based on sort of the Hobbesian notion that what man seeks is pleasure and seeks to avoid is pain, that's just not correct. It's not correct in any fundamental sense. What it may be true on a moment-to-moment sense, but people routinely seek out pain in pursuit of a higher pleasure, right?
It's also predicated on the idea that what constitutes pleasure and what constitutes pain is momentarily self-evident, which it isn't. Because sometimes the most pleasurable things require a fair bit of pain to attain. And so, again, it's the problem of iteration. Is like, well, pleasure and pain computed over what time frame? Well, we're not going to address that. It's obvious. It's like, no, it's not. It's not obvious in the least. And so it's just specious. you see this with these arguments of that sort, that men pursue pleasure and avoid pain. It's like you are acting as if what pleasure and pain constitute are self-evident. They're self-evident descriptions of the structure of underlying reality. You've crammed all of underlying reality into those two words then.
Right.
It's like, well, here's what motivates us, pleasure and pain. You divided the whole cosmos into those two things. And then you think, well, I'm just going to accept that axiomatic proposition. You know what pleasure is then, do you? It's like, well, that's not so simple. It's certainly not so simple psychologically. And you know, when economists test out those predictions, say made on that narrow utilitarianism, which is bound in the moment, they find people don't act like that at all. And the behavioral economists have demolished the conceptual preconceptions of classical economics by playing relatively simple trading games and showing, well, no, people don't actually act like that at all if you actually look at how they act.
I think that what being in a place like this really reminds you of is again, the suppositions that we make in the West about how human activity and human motivation are just plain wrong in many cases. Because again, that's
the flaw of rationalism,
right?
Rather
exactly.
than the flaw of empiricism.
Yep. I mean, this is the sort of Michael Oakeshott or F.A. Hayek point, which is that you can rationalize your way into anything. And you believe, again, like you were saying, that what you're doing is for quote-unquote rational reasons. But the reality is that what you're doing because it was most likely handed down to you over an extraordinary period of time, and you were brought up in it to the point where you are acculturated to it. And to simply reject that heritage out of a fit of pique or in a search for individual identity, I mean, that's the real danger that I see right now, is that it used to be, at least you could make the case, and now I'm going to steel man Marxism for a second, but at least you could make the case that it was a search for a better world, that it was the search for a better form of humanity, communally speaking. We were all going to live better together because if we transform our community, then we'll transform the individual. It's wrong, but at least you make the case.
You could make the case that before it was demonstrated to be wrong, it was at least arguably plausible.
Right, and now because that failed, the replacement for that was not, okay, maybe we ought to think again about what it is that we lost. Maybe what we're actually thinking about is something more. Maybe what we're actually thinking about is should be just ourselves, free-floating individual souls that are wandering about in the chaos. And that's what we should be shooting for. Forget the community entirely. Forget transforming social conditions. None of that really matters. The only social condition that ought to be transformed is the one that hems me in on an individual level.
Well, that's kind of that's a degenerative liberal Protestantism, I would say, to some degree. So the only thing that's real is the ultimately atomized individual. And that's such a catastrophically self-defeating view. I mean, I see this practically too. I think part of the reason my lectures have been attractive to people is because I've been able to make the case that you're most likely to find the meaning that sustains you in life as a consequence of adopting responsibility in relationship to others. And then you can just explain to people how that works. Is, well, let's say you're really sick. Something's gone wrong in your life, and which is going to happen. Well, hedonism isn't going to save you then, that's for sure, because that's gone. And then, well, what are you going to rely on to get you through that? Well, let's say you're alone and isolated and you've never taken responsibility for anyone. It's like, oh, good. So now you're going to be sick and suffering alone. That's going to end well. Or alternatively, you've put some time and effort into the people around you and they're there to buoy you up when the catastrophe comes, and all that's accrued through responsibility. And maybe even there'll be something to you that's there to buoy you up through catastrophe because you've sacrificed your narrow, whim-based, atomistic, liberal Protestant hedonism to something like service to your higher self, that iterated self across time, maybe across generations. So you have some character to rely on when the storms come too. People understand that very quickly if you explain it to them. It's like, oh, that's why I should take responsibility. It's like, yeah, that's building an ark, man. That's for sure.
It's also, because you're speaking intergenerationally, I think that what really gets lost in the sort of liberal ethic that you're talking about, because it's so individualist, there's this peculiar version of what Marxists would call homo economist, right? The the Marxist critique of capitalism is that capitalism is largely about individuals who act in their own rational self-interest with regard to capital, and that's not true. That's not exactly how people work. So
right. Well, it's partly because what do you mean rational self-interest?
Right.
Exactly.
Right. And so this is the work of Kahneman and the behavioral economists you're talking about, is to debunk a lot of that. And so the corollary to that is this idea that human beings are always grown up. Children are grown-ups. They're sort of in a rational individual, and that individual is all that matters at the heart of you. And they're never a child. They don't need any boundaries. They don't need any rules. They don't need any structures. And so if we get rid of all that stuff, then you can be the true you. A 4-year-old can't be the true you, but you start to see this ethic creep into that right now.
All structures are barriers.
Right now, 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds can be the true you, right? The true you it's identified by mommy and daddy, of course, who can identify your rule-breaking behavior immediately, right? But if you actually want to bring up
rebellion against social order is the true you.
Exactly.
God, what a dismal view that is.
And dangerous to kids, because kids actually need these structures. I mean, what we're really talking about...
Well, kids actually manifest those rebellious behaviors precisely to discover the structures, because they're looking to be hemmed in relationship to their anxiety. So they push, and they think, well, I'm hoping I'm going to find a wall here, because otherwise I'm in an infinite expanse. And they'll keep pushing, and if the expanse gets big enough, then the child, in some sense, the child has no choice but to collapse into himself. That's what happens when a child has had enough. It's like, well, that's too much. There's too much choice. There's too much possibility. There's too much chaos. And that's a terrible thing to do to a child. They want the domain of constrained choice they're capable of mastering at their developmental level. And that's what it's up to you to provide as a parent.
And
no more challenge than necessary. No.
And this is why, it's interesting. My parents became more religious when I was a kid. They'd always been interested in religion, but they hadn't become fully religious. They became Orthodox when I was maybe 9, 10, 11 years old. And one of the reasons for that is because my mom and dad basically decided there needs to be some system within which we raise our children. And that system has to both make sense to us, but also has to provide a grounding and a set of boundaries that are behaviorally good for our kids. And as people abandon parenthood, the easiest thing for yourself, because you're a rational adult, of course, and you can pursue your own self-interest how you see fit, is to abandon religion, because it allows you to pursue whatever pleasure you wish to pursue. But when you're raising
whatever whim.
Right, exactly. But when it comes to your kids, this is where people start to get correctly defensive. And it's and one of the great tragedies of the West is that as we've had fewer kids, it's tied you less to the institutions that are necessary to actually preserve the society, because what preserves a society is how you raise your kids. That's the most important thing that you do.
You're not bound by the necessity of long-term iteration, which is the sustainability the leftists are always talking about. That's really that.
That's a great, by the way, that is a great term, meaning, like, we're constantly talking about environmental sustainability. What about human sustainability?
Well, those aren't even separable, because if we destroy human sustainability, we'll absolutely destroy the planet. Clearly, obviously, we'll degenerate into nuclear war, or we'll demolish the environment in fits of starvation and catastrophe. And so there's no saving the planet outside the truly sustainable human enterprise. For better or worse, we're stewards of the garden. That's the nature of the cosmos. That's for sure.
And I don't think, but I think we don't think often enough in terms of how do you sustain human civilization? How do you maintain, or in your words, how do you cultivate? I think that we worry mostly about just walking around naked in the garden as much as humanly possible, and that cultivation is a real thing. Like that's an amazing thing in Genesis. Like the notion that you're placed in paradise, but you have a job in paradise. Like, that's not the way that people think now, right? If you're placed in paradise, the first thing you do is you vacation, right? You don't have a job. You don't have anything to do, right? Exactly. And the first thing God says is you're in the garden. Here's a few things for you to do, right? You're going to name some animals. You're going to cultivate. You're going to keep and cultivate the garden, because the idea is even in paradise, human beings have to have something to do. And the thing to do is to continue to cultivate that garden and make sure that garden is operational and safe.
Better and better garden.
And when you ignore that, and when you just eat the fruit of the garden without continuing the cultivation, when you neglect your duty, then that's when the snake wins, presumably.
Yeah.
So it's, these are all concepts that I think that the West has forgotten a little bit.
Well, it's something to be able to think of responsibility as opportunity and not constraint. And that, I would say, of all the things that I've been talking to people about, that's the one that strikes home most particularly, that responsibility is opportunity and not constraint. The narrative world and the objective world, it's the juxtaposition of the narrative world, and that would be Jerusalem in some real sense, and the objective world that defines Western civilization. And you see that narrative spirit attempting to revivify itself in the Jerusalem of today. And that's a good thing, because that narrative spirit, if that deep and meat narrative spirit doesn't rejuvenate itself, it will just be replaced by far inferior variants, dangerous, shallow, unsustainable, anxiety-provoking, hopeless, miserable, vengeful, murderous. Yeah, so a better vision than that is definitely something we need. And it's certainly the case that everyone here, I would say to some degree, is striving to produce that, stumbling uphill towards the temple on the mount and the city of God.
If the city of peace can be created, it's going to be through the principles of the city of peace, which is why it's named that way. And the place where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, the place where Jacob had his dream of angels going up and down. My prayer at the end of the meal is that that the angels that descend up and down in Jacob's dream continue to connect the higher realms to the lower, and that we ought to learn from that, and that we ought to strengthen that connection in ourselves and for our communities and for our civilization.
That's right. We could add to that a prayer that we have enough sense as individuals to allow that ladder to move its information, its message up and down the different realms of being, right, within the confines of our own thought and our own life. So, yeah, that's a good prayer. That's for sure. Cheers.
Well, Jordan, cheers.
Where are we?
We are on the site of a miracle, the Parthenon. In some ways, what you're looking at is a monument to the height of Athenian civic greatness.
This is where the spirit of free speech and free association began. Join Spencer Clavin and me as we delve into the origins of democracy here in Athens, Greece.